Welcome back, Linda Moulton Howe, with us with part two of this strange story.
Well, since I started investigating animal mutilations in 1979, 34 years ago, I've been exposed to a lot. And I have encountered people who have worked either at Area 51 or Edwards or China Lake or Wright-Patterson or Eglin in Florida. There are certain places, and they have told me that they knew for a fact, in whatever work they were being exposed to, that one of the things this government does is when they have, let's say, I'm going to call it a whole piece of extraterrestrial biological entity technology, and they're trying to experiment with it. One of the things they will do is precisely that, put something that makes it to the outside world or even people who don't have a need to know in an agency. They will put on something like that, stencil letters, so anyone looking at it just casually would assume it was some sort of a government project. And we don't have the ability that I know to make anything out of matter that can go from the ground to the zenith in a few seconds without making some kind of a crash through the sound barrier. That's some other kind of technology.
Let's do that.
There's one really important thing. He said that articulated arm that came down with the bright light, he said it moved the way a snake moves, meaning it was fluid, not mechanical. And when it became aware of them, he said the head just came straight up and the light was on them in a half a second.
Might whatever they saw, Linda, could that have been a drone?
Oh, I think that we are dealing with lots and lots of drones in the UFO phenomena, meaning something that is a self-activating machine, it is programmed, and it doesn't need a prime intelligence operating inside of it. I think that's quite clear in everything that I have learned about the extraterrestrial biological entity technology that our government has been trying to understand and back engineer for a very long time. And you asked before the break about, well, what could this be about? And before we hear the rest of JS's disc encounter, I want to go back to 1990 and another disc on tripod legs. I was concept creator and supervising producer for the Hour pilot in that TV series called Sightings that was first broadcast October 18th, 1991 on the Fox network. And one of the segments that we were producing was about U.S. astronaut sightings of unidentified aerial objects. And one of the astronauts that I interviewed at length was aeronautical engineer and test pilot Gordon Cooper. He was the youngest of the 7 original astronauts in Project Mercury. That was the first manned space program for the United States. Cooper was launched aboard the Mercury Atlas 9 that was known as Space 7 on May 15, 1963, and that was the last Mercury mission, and he orbited the Earth 22 times, the longest of any astronaut up to that point. Well, during our 1991 interview for the TV program Sightings, Gordon Cooper told me that in 1957, at age 30, he was a U.S. Air Force captain assigned to an experimental flight test engineering division at Edwards Air Force Base in California, and that on May 3rd, 1957, around 8 o'clock in the morning on a dry lake bed at Edwards, there was a photography crew that was setting up a high-precision camera system to photograph in both still and 35-millimeter motion picture. Their job was to photograph various kinds of experimental tests out there. The crew phoned Gordon Cooper. He told me, I pick up the phone, and it's this crew. And they report that they had filmed an approximate 3 to 4 foot diameter silver disc that silently came down from the sky towards the ground, hovered over them, and at a distance of about 150 feet, landed by extending 3 thin tripod legs to the ground. And the crew assumed that it was a U.S. government test flight to be photographed, and they photographed it all over the place. Well, this surprised Gordon Cooper. He raised his eyebrows and grinned at me at that moment. He said, boy, I wanted to see that film, and I knew that I needed to let my superiors know. So he told this crew to bring the photos and film to him as soon as it was processed, and he did look at the stills, and he did look at the film, and he told me that when he did call the Pentagon, that they said they were sending a jet courier that was to go immediately back to Washington, and that he was surprised when he made the call that at the Pentagon that he kept being handed off to someone higher and higher in the chain of command until he was instructed by a general to get this film and those photos processed, but to this courier in the jet to go back to Washington. And Cooper told me he was amazed at the clarity and the small silver disc that moved so fluidly and extended these three little legs in a tripod pattern as this disc gently settled onto the ground, and then it lifted off without any issue at all. And he told me that this dramatic, whatever this was, of unknown origin was something that he expected to hear more about, but there was no follow-up, and he said he tried many times to find out about this film and the photos that he had seen and never could get any answers until his death in 2004. Gordon Cooper insisted the U.S. government was covering up the reality of other advanced intelligences and technologies interacting with this planet. And I think it is so interesting that here is an astronaut describing a disk on these thin little legs. And we're going to pick up now again with JS as he describes a bizarre, low rumbling sound that starts near the big disk on the little tripod legs in Los Cerrillos.
There's this noise, and I'll try to do my best to simulate it, but it was a very low-frequency rumbling sound. And there's two things that go on here. There's a frequency, that's the time between rumbles, and then there's an amplitude, which is the amount of force that's generated from that. As it starts up, there's a vroom, and then a vroom. I can't really duplicate it that well because of the fact that the force that was generated by this is just so immense that it's very hard. And I think it actually started below where we could hear, and then it came up into an auditory range. Then and the amplitude of the noise decreased, but the frequency made it go faster and faster and faster.
How today do you understand that this strong rumble below the ground would be related to a hovering disc that was no longer attached to the ground in any way?
It still had its legs on the ground, and then this noise, because it went completely dead, and then it fired back up again. And then this noise, the amplitude is coming down and the frequency is going faster. You hear kind of a very high-pitched turbine noise until it finally got so fast that with the amplitude gone and with the frequency so fast, you couldn't hear it no more. And the lights were oscillating or doing the thing that they do on the outside, and also on the tower, on the hat. They're just running like they were normal. And then we watched it elevate from its three-leg position up about 6 inches off the ground. And then the disc at that point retracted the legs, and all three legs retracted simultaneously, and it hovered, just like when it came in. It hovered in space like it was rock solid, floating above the ground, absolutely rock solid. And then the strangest thing that I saw that was amazing was this disc that's elevated off the floor of the desert 6-8 feet, with legs retracted. It looks as though somebody was in a car and had their foot off the brake and then took off the parking brake. And it just kind of slid forward about 6 or 8 inches, and it was just remarkable. Like, wow, it just looked like somebody took the parking brake off this thing. And now, again, there's no sound here, no sound at all. And then it starts moving at about 5 or 6 miles an hour across the mesa, and it takes off. It starts going faster and faster, and it tilts a little bit to about a 40 or 50 degree angle, and then it just takes straight off and I watched it until I couldn't watch it anymore, which is about 20 to 30 seconds.
Did it go straight up?
The whole vehicle rotated to about a 50-degree attack angle to the sky, and then it just stayed on that attack angle and just took straight up at a 50-degree angle with no noise and no sonic booms, no nothing, until it was gone. I did go back the next morning after that event. I just had to come to peace with it. So I actually went to the specific location the next morning. This happened approximately 11:45 at night and continued for about a half hour to 40 minutes after 11:45. And I could see the imprints, the 3 imprints in the desert floor on the Table Mesa where the craft sat. I could also see the prints from our trucks and where we had positioned the trucks, and our footprints in some of the dust in that area with our boots. I was actually kind of frightened from the fact that we got as close to it as we did. I could still see the imprints, and I kind of came to peace with I wasn't hallucinating it, he wasn't hallucinating it, and the fact that it was there and it took off.
What did the marks in the ground look like to you?
Yeah, they were about 2.5 to 3 inches into the desert. It was kind of a hard-packed sand. Looked like rectangular pads, about 5 or 6 inches, and then about 4 inches by 6 inches, and they went in about 2.5 inches, 3 of them.
4 by 6 inch rectangles that went down into the hard packed sandy ground, about 2.5 inches each.
Right. And if you were to see the size of the disc, and you saw the legs that came out from the disc, the thing had to weigh nothing. Those legs, their maximum diameter was probably not more than 1.5 inches. And you see this disc that's 60 feet is being held up with the engine off by these 3 legs.
And it doesn't compute in terms of 60 feet diameter being able to be supported by 3 thin legs.
Yeah, I was staring at it with the light was on underneath of it. And I was looking at the legs. I can't believe that this thing is being held up by these 3 skinny legs. You know, my engineering side tells me that either those legs are extremely strong or that thing's extremely light. Based on the metallurgy of what the legs could be a composite of, they would have to be extremely strong to be able to hold that up.
If it had weight.
If it had weight, correct. I would say maybe 800 pounds per leg.
Well, that would make then the 60-foot disc quite light.
Yes, absolutely.
And that supports even further the hypothesis that this disc, like others, are acting in a drone mode, that they are self-activating machines programmed to do work on this planet, but the prime intelligence that made them, it is not necessary for that intelligence to be in these craft, that these craft are operating the way we now have drones operating over Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world.
I went back to take a look at the pod prints from the disc, but I also looked very closely at where the light, as I mentioned to you, it was burning some of the grass at the time.
Right.
And I looked at the soil, and the soil got so hot that it actually bleached the soil white.
Wow.
You know, my thought was it was doing some surface surveying, some radiometric stuff where you're looking for geomagnetic interference or something, and it's surveying the land, getting magnetic readings to see if there's something down there. That's the first thing I thought of. And it ties into your discussion about maybe it's here analyzing the surface for something important.
And that it can extract at the atomic or molecular level with that light. And what was it that it was extracting? That is a mystery.
Yeah, that part I don't know, but it was doing something. And it just wasn't once or twice. It was working hard, doing whatever it was for several minutes.
What would you speculate that would have turned the soil white?
Well, intense heat. You remember I told you that the sound was actually kind of coming from beneath my feet as I was standing there? It was actually shaking the earth so much that the stuff rolled off of the hood. And as it was starting up, there was dust from the surface that was emanating because of the vibration of the power going into the floor of the desert. And dust was being thrown up into the air, this superfine dust. And then it slowly stopped as it started spinning faster and faster and faster. Then the dust started to settle back down. But even after it had left, there was still dust in the air from when this thing fired up.